Good evening and welcome to Dessert and Dish. Dessert and Dish is an interview feature inviting real people to dish on the real challenges and blessings of living faithful lives. Dessert and Dish, as the name suggests, includes dessert, something local or homemade, ideally. This little gift of sweetness offers us a reminder of our connection to the communities around us, to the God we seek to love, and whose desire for us is that we know joy. And somehow I find, anyway, that a little dessert makes good conversation even better. Tonight, I am really excited and so thrilled to introduce all of you to Gareth Higgins. Welcome, Gareth. Gareth is an author, an activist, and somebody who inspires community and conversation all across the world. Gareth, we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into introducing you in a moment, but we also need to introduce our desserts. So you said that you do have some dessert to share with us.
I do. I do. I have it's incredibly simple but really profound to me. You want me to do you want
Yeah,
to see it? It's
yeah, I
really
do.
simple. It's just some raspberries, but the reason that I brought them is I'm in Ireland at the moment, which is where I'm from, but it's not where I live. And
Okay.
you get different raspberries here than you do where I live.
Is that
And
right?
to me, these are the taste of home and of summer, even though it's not summer at the moment. I'm assuming these have come from a greenhouse
Right, right.
somewhere. And then also the simplicity of one raspberry. I was taken through an exercise once with a grape, but it works with a raspberry as well. Just a
Okay.
small piece of fruit. You could do it with a Brazil nut or something like that. To really go through the experience of meditating on what you're eating,
Mm,
um, and eating it slowly, and letting the flavor of one raspberry kind of wake you up. So that's why I brought these.
oh, I love that. And I
And I'm
love
going to eat one of them now.
yeah, please eat one and enjoy it. I love that raspberries taste different in Ireland than where you currently live, and that makes sense, right? Because like they're grown out of particular soil and
Yeah,
climate conditions,
yeah.
and you can taste that, right? Like we live in the Niagara region,
Mm,
so we're very interested in terroir and wine and how that reflects the
hmm
climate
hmm
and the context. So my dessert for tonight is also pretty simple, not quite as simple maybe as raspberries, but this is bark, chocolate bark.
Oh, nice.
And it has four ingredients. It has butter, brown sugar, crackers, and chocolate. But the reason why I wanted to have bark for our conversation is because bark was the thing that my mom could always whip up in a heartbeat. Like if
Huh.
as a busy working mom, like if
hmm
there was
hmm
a bake sale at school or
Mm,
somebody needed something, somebody was in distress, she always had the ingredients to whip up this chocolate bark, and it tastes pretty miraculous.
mm,
And I was quite excited to surprise my kids with it this
mm.
morning. They were pretty happy when they got up this morning and saw this
Nice.
bark to eat. So
I'd like to have some of that.
I know. Well, I am so glad that we get to have this conversation that we really wouldn't be able to have if it weren't for a Zoom platform because
hmm
you're in Ireland. But the downfall of the Zoom platform is that there really is no way of, um, you know, getting our dessert over to each other. Like,
If we were in Star Trek, there would be.
yeah, or Harry Potter.
How do they do it in Harry Potter?
Yeah, like we could apparate the desserts to each other.
Is that right? I'm not familiar enough with Harry Potter to know, but I know that in Star Trek they just press the button into the machine and then the thing opens and it's a perfect gourmet meal.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the next frontier for our
Okay.
platforms. Anyway, I'd love to taste your raspberry, but maybe I'll have to get to Ireland someday and try them in person. So, Gareth, why don't you share a little bit more about yourself? I'll just start by saying how we met.
Mhm,
Met in 2019 at the News Story Festival in Austin, Texas. I was a workshop leader that year. That was the inaugural festival, correct?
mhm,
And you were one of two main organizers of that event. And that's an ongoing community and an ongoing network of
mhm.
people. Can you just share a little bit more about what you're up to these days and what keeps you busy?
Sure. Well, I'm one of those people that doesn't have a job title, but someone gave me one recently that I quite like, and that was they called me a story activist. And
Oh,
I think what that means is I tell stories and I try to help other people learn and share better stories about themselves and
mm,
who we are in the world and how we can lean more into the things that we all know in our heart of hearts
yeah.
are the better way, which is primarily uh, to love your neighbor as yourself and to devote yourself to love of reality with a capital R.
Mm,
Some call that God. Some people don't use that language. I don't think that's the most important thing. The point is to devote yourself to love and
mm,
to um, conceive of love as being something other than what greetings cards tend to say love
yeah.
is. That it's not about sentimentality, it's actually about service,
Mm,
about stretching yourself for the sake of others and allowing yourself to be served by others too. Because otherwise, that's just if you're the one doing all the serving, that's martyrdom.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you never do any serving, you kind of are living an isolated life where you're not going to be in touch with the richer and deeper things to do with interdependency with other human beings and with the ecosystem. So um, that's kind of the focus of what I feel called to do. And I do it through writing books, editing a magazine, helping plan festivals and other creative convenings, including retreats that we lead here in Ireland, where we bring
Okay.
people over to reflect on, the inner journey of what it means to become a peaceable, courageous person on the
Mm,
inside, and then on the outside to act upon the world for the sake of the common good, rather than just let the world happen to you.
yeah. Yeah.
Uh, that's what I get to do. I have a background as an academic sociologist and a teacher of reconciliation studies, um, and I get to do a lot of reading, and I get to do a lot of watching movies because I think those forms of storytelling need to be interpreted
Mhm.
within our culture. And I'm part of communities full of other people who are wonderfully talented and gifted, and we're all kind of working together to look after each other and see what we can do to help other people in need too.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I feel like that was just so uh, well represented in that News Story Festival that, like, it was just amazing to be part of all of different, um, these different cultures,
Yeah.
different religious traditions, different expressions of
Mm.
that same desire and that same willingness to come together. My dogs are about to bark, I think. Oh, no. Okay. Somebody just delivered.
Another kind of bark is
The dogs
welcome.
are going to go crazy. Yeah, that's another kind of.
That's the other kind of bark.
Um, yeah, it was a wonderful thing to be part of,
Hmm.
and I love the variety of ways of expressing that ongoing that
Thank you. Good.
project. Yeah, that you're leading for us. So today we're talking about your brand new book. It hasn't, as we're talking, it hasn't quite officially been released yet, but very soon, next week, I think. So the book is How Not to Be Afraid. Now you have to read it backwards, I guess, on my screen, but
No, but I'm seeing it the right way.
you're seeing
There
it
it
the right.
is too.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm seeing it.
So maybe it's it looks like it's backwards on mine. So,
Okay.
if you're really good at reading things in the wrong order, you can borrow my copy.
There we go. How Not to Be Afraid. 7 Ways to Live When Everything Seems Terrifying. And, I think your unofficial job title as a story activist is very emblematic of kind of the heart of this book, I would say. I've spent a lot of time as I've been reading it thinking just about the title, um, How Not to Be Afraid. I mean, you could hear that title as like how to have no fear,
Mhm.
how to not be afraid of anything. Um, but that isn't actually how you're turning that phrase. Like
That's right.
it's more about um, how to not be afraid of the wrong things in the wrong ways.
You
Right.
got it. Yeah, it's absolutely it's definitely not called How Not to Feel Fear,
Right.
or how to get rid of fear, because fear is inevitable. Fear is even necessary. It's a biological inevitability, and I think it's a sociological necessity. And by that I mean our brains have these kind of fear devices inside them,
Yeah.
that have evolved in response to the presence of actual threat. The example that's usually given is the fear of saber-toothed tigers hiding in that bush, or rampaging horde around the next corner. And those were actual threats that
Yeah.
our forebears, isn't that the word, had, long, 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 long time ago. And the best purpose of those inevitable uh, fear devices is they protect us from
Mhm.
actual things that are actually dangerous to our lives. Good example would be, don't walk too close to the edge of that cliff,
Yeah.
right? Or put your seatbelt on, or don't press too hard on the accelerator there.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, those are good, healthy fears.
Yeah.
The problem is that our brains have not evolved fast enough to catch up with the speed with which information bombards us in our current culture. And then, this didn't start with the internet. If you look back, when newspapers first became prevalent, people were terrified that meant that nobody would know what was true anymore. Or
Right.
when telephones arrived, no one would ever have meaningful face-to-face conversation anymore. And
Right.
people have had it about kind of video calling, as well, that this isn't real. But when we've been forced, through circumstance of the pandemic, I think lots of us have found, yeah, sure, we have Zoom fatigue, but we've also found ways to make this kind of interaction meaningful. And as you
Yes.
already named, the virtue is that we can have the conversation at all while you're in Canada and I'm in Ireland.
Mhm.
Um, so so that, like I say, we've got this necessary and inevitable side to it, but then there's a problem, because now we overread circumstances, and we often fear the wrong things,
Right.
or we fear the right things in the wrong way.
Right.
um, One of the most dangerous things on the planet is mosquitoes.
Mm.
I don't spend hardly any of my life being concerned about mosquitoes.
Right.
Right?
Right.
um, uh, I had a revelatory moment in a therapy appointment once, where the therapist was talking to me about, the most dangerous thing you will do today is get in the car to come to the therapy session.
Yeah. Right.
And that I think part of the therapy that's often used with folk who have a phobia of flying is to tell them that driving to the airport is far more dangerous than getting into the plane. You
Right.
know,
Right.
um, but of course, just offering those facts doesn't help. Well, it can help. It doesn't heal our fear. It does
Right.
not
Right.
take care of it all. Um, what we need to do is look at the story we're telling about the fear and about ourselves in relationship to the fear, because the story we're telling actually shapes the power of the fear to do something to us. And when I talk about 7 ways to live when everything seems terrifying, if you only want to think about 2 of those ways, I think they're emblematic of all 7. One is a personal practice as individuals, and the other is something we can only do together with
Right.
others. Um, if you and I would learn to breathe more slowly, our fears would begin to dissipate. This is not just a spiritual or a religious teaching about meditation and breath work, although it is that. There's neuroscience that backs it up. Sensory motor psychotherapy, which is really the science of how our physiology affects our emotions, seems to show that there's a relationship between how we move and how we feel. And it's not, if my thoughts are racing, then I might walk too fast.
Right.
Or I might walk too fast and then my thoughts will race. It's kind of both.
Right.
Kind of both. So there's personal practices of just slowing down that help. And then there are group practices of gathering with people we trust and just learning to ask the right questions that start to unlock the stories we're telling.
Yeah. Can we get into that a little bit?
Mhm.
Because there were a couple of pieces that I found really intriguing and spot on in terms of that connection with other people. So one of the things that you said is that um, often the thing we fear most isn't the actual threat, like the
Mhm.
tiger or the fall down.
Sure.
Um, the thing we actually fear is ourselves and our ability to respond to that threat. And I think what I receive in the book, and what I receive in general in your offerings, is that, like, when we try to go it alone, when we try to respond to the threat just by ourselves as kind of these um, isolated individuals, we we can't
Mhm.
respond. And you actually say that we should declare help askers the heroes of our time,
Mhm.
um, because and I'm going to quote you directly from the book because I think it's so good. um, the very request for help should be an occasion for rejoicing, for another human being is setting themselves free from the death dealing oppression that says we are alone and must fend for ourselves.
Mhm.
That's that's amazing. And I, I just wonder if you can say a little bit more about, how we become those help askers, how we
Yeah.
get connected into
Yeah.
community that helps us to
Mhm.
break out of those oppressive, manipulated fears.
Um, yeah, thank you. And I do think it's death dealing oppression, actually, that isolation, involuntary isolation, which is not the same thing as, taking time out for yourself
Right.
or being contemplative, or even, the rare person who is called to be a hermit. And there are some people for whom that is their noble calling in life. But
Mm-hmm.
even then, they still rely on other people to check in on them once in a while to make sure they have access to food and so forth. And,
Yeah.
um, um, the purpose of, I think the highest purpose of monasteries and cloisters is for people to go remove themselves from the oppressive world so that they can get renewed and then offer something back.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Absolutely.
really just an extension of the principle of the weekend.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
or the Sabbath, or not working 24/7.
Yeah.
And uh, so this thing about help asking, the reason I think it's heroic is that is twofold. First of all, my friend Chance Thoreau recently defined heroism as creating safety for other people around you without harming anybody else.
Okay.
Right. So you could sort of see, the kind of archetype of, I don't know, Rambo,
Okay.
Rambo's kind of held up as a heroic figure, but and Rambo may well create some safety for some people, but he certainly harms other people on the way to doing that. But the truest form of heroism would be to be willing to do the work that it takes to create safety for others around you, particularly those more vulnerable than you or I are, and make a commitment not to harm anybody, or to at least do the best you can to reduce the harm that might be caused to other people who are perhaps not as vulnerable. That's the first reason that I think, asking for help is a heroic act, because it actually does create safety. If you think about the number of times that someone needed help, someone you care about deeply. I mean, I can give you a precise example from my life right now. My mother recently fractured a leg and has needed support because she's in plaster, and she, the first period after fracturing, like, she literally could hardly move around the house, and we were with her and doing what we could to help. And friends would call and ask her, hey, is there anything you need? And she would default through a cultural lens. It's very normative in this culture that I come from, to say, oh, no, I don't need anything. I don't need anything. And the perception I had was that she was embarrassed to say, actually, I do need some help. And if she had said, yes, I do need some help, and here's the specifics of what that help would be, two kinds of safety would have been created. One is, she would have got some of the help. You don't always get the help that you ask for, but she would have got some of it. Right. And secondly, myself and my husband would have been less worried about her. Right. So we would actually have felt safer. And this is not to single out my mother, because we all do this. It just happens to be the most recent example. What I really trust is when someone says, yes, actually, I do need help, and I can specify what I need. Can you help me with this part? And especially if they give me the freedom to say, well, actually, I don't think I can do that part, but I can help with this, or I can help you connect with that. And something perhaps even more amazing is we can learn how to say no to people's requests in a way that leaves them feeling more loved, right? And I had a need once and expressed it to a friend, and I was being kind of needy, victimy, mopey about it. And my friend knew, as a wise person, that what I needed more was to go through this experience. Right. She made this judgment, and she responded to me, I'm so sorry you're going through this experience. It sounds like a real burden. I love you, and I'll see you on the other side. And she knew, like, if it was an emergency, she would have stepped in, or I would have asked from somebody else. And initially, when I got that text back, I gritted my teeth. I thought, why did you send me that? And then eventually I realized, no, this is exactly what I need. So the two forms of heroism are, you create safety for others. And the second form, and the second reason I think it's heroic, is the culture we inhabit denies vulnerability as strength more often than it champions it. This culture, that this Western industrialized electronic culture, is confused about what it really values. It is sending mixed messages. Brene Brown can get millions and millions and millions of views to a TED talk championing vulnerability as the path to more life. But what happens when a politician running for public office says at a debate, You know what? I honestly don't know the answer to your question. I've really thought about it, and I just don't know. That's what I mean about the mixed message.
Yeah, yeah,
Brene Brown's message. I want it to spread, and I
yeah.
want it to be modeled. Now, I think it used to be that if you were vulnerable at all, I remember there was a US presidential candidate who nobody remembers their name from the early 70s who cried during a press conference,
Right,
and
right.
he ended his campaign the next day
Wow.
because the fallout from a man,
Hmm.
and I don't
Hmm.
think it would have been much easier. I mean, first of all,
No.
patriarchy was making it less likely that a woman would be running for president. But a man crying on television, there's no way he can be the commander in chief. Whereas my view would be, he cried on television. I
Yeah,
trust him more, unless it's fake tears.
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, I trust him more. So help askers are heroic because they're acting in a countercultural way. It's
Hmm.
difficult to do it
Hmm.
because the culture hasn't taught us how to do it. And they're also heroic because it induces more safety in the world.
Yeah,
There is
yeah.
a difference between manifesting as a bottomless pit of need. And that's what
Mhm.
therapy is for. And
Right, right.
sometimes, and that's what my friend was doing for me, saying, hey, no, this is not one of those legitimate asks. This is you're just being mopey here. Um, and you can really learn how to ask for help if you're in a community that affirms your gifts as well as your needs. And so perhaps you ask me for something if we were in ongoing community together,
Hmm. Hmm.
and my response would be, yes, of course. And can you help me with this thing? And
Yeah,
not that it's
yeah.
transactional, it's about energetic exchange so that you're not left feeling like you're always the weak one and I'm
Right.
always the strong one.
I mean, I think it's empowering in a lot of ways when that help asking that you're identifying is offered, right? Because not only does it model that this vulnerability is okay, it also allows others um, to to know specifically how they can help. I mean,
Mhm,
we can do a lot of hand wringing in
mhm,
response to the needs that we see in people that we care about, and we don't know always
mhm.
how to help. And yeah, I think um,
Well, sorry, yeah, no, I don't want to interrupt you.
yeah, no, I think just manifesting that ask in a way that invites reciprocity is a beautiful thing.
Hmm. And just briefly, to use the kind of, I always prefer to talk about, Richard Rohr says the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better, which I think means like incarnate, embody, and talk about the good thing first.
Mm,
There's social, scientific, and psychological research that seems to indicate you need 4 or 5 positive affirmations to overcome the burden of a negative comment or a critique.
right.
And so I always prefer to start with the thing that can be affirmed. So,
Mm,
I remember being in a room where somebody made a homophobic remark, and I became really quite angry. And it was a public setting where it just seemed impossible to know what to do. And I kind of walked very quickly down to the back of the room where one of the other people in charge
mm.
was there, and I was like, just like, and I'm very upset, legitimately so. And his response to me as another LGBTQ person was, what can we do right now to minimize the damage that's being done, and what can we do next time to make sure something better
Right.
happens? So it 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 was like he cut through. Where I wanted to go was just to denounce what was happening.
Yeah.
He wanted to take it to the next piece, was, can we actually do something in this moment to make the situation better right now?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
me expressing my upset is something that I can do later, and it may need some personal processing. The the but so that's why I led with why why it's heroic to ask for help and dwelled on that, I want to say the negative piece, or perhaps the stick rather than the carrot, and give less time to that. But it is important to say that the unintended consequences of not asking for help as individuals, as communities and nations go to one of two directions.
Okay.
Either towards suicide,
Mm.
and it can mean literal suicide, or just self-harm or cultural self-harm, diminishing our lives,
Mm-hmm.
or toward destruction.
Right.
That
Right.
if we don't learn to ask for help, we might build up and build up and build up pressure and lash out. And whether it's just we lash out through character assassination, or we go down the full continuum toward genocide,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's part of the same continuum. So
Yeah.
not only is it heroic to ask for help, I would say it might be selfish not to.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that you definitely articulate that in the book that, if you look at some of the most destructive figures in human
Yeah.
history, you can actually make a pretty direct link um, to that like internalized need to not
Mm-hmm.
in mutual vulnerable human relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's not to say that,
Consequences are real.
if someone had been nicer to Hitler, that the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. Obviously, we can't retroactively say that, but I think what we can say is we don't know what would have happened if somebody had tried,
Yeah.
right? And just because Hitler's the most obvious example, the one that's talked about but not thought about enough.
Mhm.
Stalin and Pol Pot are the other two individuals, along with Adolf Hitler, responsible for the three largest genocides of the 20th century. And there is a really important question to be asked about what would early intervention in their lives have looked like. Now,
Yeah.
perhaps the psychopathy that seems to have been present in all three of them would have just taken over, but not it's not so much that we've tried these things, we've researched them and we've evaluated that it didn't work. I just think we haven't tried.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. And um, I think naming them as examples does help us to be clear about what the stakes can be.
Mm-hmm.
That there's an invitation to personal well-being and joy, but that is very much linked um, to our communities and our whole human family.
Well, and lest we get ahead of ourselves or we become overwhelmed by thinking about these large scale horrors, and sources of fear, uh, start with your next door neighbor.
Yeah, yeah,
Or start actually with yourself. Get into a dialogue with yourself and ask, what do I need help for from my higher self?
yeah,
Um, and then do it with a friend, and look into things like nonviolent communication, which advances the principle that all communication is an attempt at getting a need met, and there are no illegitimate needs. There are just
mm,
more or less legitimate ways of getting your needs met.
right,
And
right.
um, we should be teaching this to children so that they grow up to be the kind of adults who have emotional literacy,
Yeah,
in interacting, that have the capacity to preempt, uh, anticipate needs in others,
yeah,
work healthily with boundaries, and discover the joy of being a person who who knows at all times that there's a core group of people who are going to be there for me, and
mm,
whom I'm going to be there for as well.
yeah, yeah. I think that that's such a thread about the fears that you identify that can be so badly manipulated is that
Mm,
they leave us feeling paralyzed, right? Like
mhm,
when,
mhm.
when fear, kind of going back to our where we started, like fear in and of itself is a gift. It's a gift that is given to us to essentially protect life, to
Yeah,
further the cause of life.
yeah.
But when it becomes used and manipulated in the wrong ways, it can leave us feeling helpless and paralyzed. And I think that one of kind of the major obstacles to um, doing something that makes a difference is that you don't know where to start. Like it seems like the world is just so full of problems and issues, and what's one person going to do in the face of this? And I love that, just calling back to like, hey, how about your neighbor? How about yourself? Like start there, like start.
Mhm,
I think the key is start.
mhm.
And I think that's such an important component in terms of breaking open that fear cycle, is like you can start somewhere and it can be really simple.
Yeah, and you don't start at the end.
Yeah, yeah,
You don't start with the victory or the achievement or world peace or a reversal to climate change or a replacement of authoritarian populism with interdependent, uh, uh, common good oriented social democracy. These things they may well all happen. We get the opportunity to participate in making them happen, but that's not where you can't start with the end. I would encourage people to start with a question, and the question is, what story am I telling?
mm,
And we can develop a facility with this question through asking about things like, what do I know about my name? Why was I given this name? Perhaps a parent has told me that I'm called Gareth for a reason. And what do I know about where I grew up? And what's the story that the people who live near me tell about who we are? Those
right,
those are examples that pretty much everybody can identify with, and then start to ask, are those stories the truest version of the stories that we could come up with?
mm, mm,
And if they are we telling them in the most helpful way?
right,
Um, and alongside starting with the question, there's a premise that I think when we test it, we find it to be true. And that is, our brains have a negativity bias.
okay,
Our news media has a negativity bias, and our political cultures have a negativity bias.
right,
So, we know that the brain over the amygdala, these fear devices in our brains, they overstate threat. They can't tell the difference between a saber-toothed tiger waiting around the corner, or a better example would be a car um, backfiring or a gunshot.
right, right,
Right. The amygdala can't tell the difference between those two things. The only thing we have to go through this second process, which is storytelling. We discern a story about that loud bang that we
hmm
made.
hmm
And if it's a car, it's one thing. If it's a gun, it's another thing. Then we have a story about guns wherever we are. Like if a gunshot went off near where I'm sitting right now, that would be scary because there are no guns being,
right,
that are well, there are very, very few guns that are legally held here. Whereas if you're near a firing range, it's less scary,
right, yeah,
right?
yeah,
So we have this negativity bias in the brain. There's the negativity bias in the news media, and I've worked in the media, so I have a lot of respect for good journalists who are in it. But it's still systemically biased toward, here's the thing that went wrong today,
mm,
rather than here's the thing that's gradually been getting better for the last decade.
mm,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and um, and then there's this negativity bias and polarization bias in our political culture. First of all, that feeds on the story that says elected politics is the most important structure system in a nation. It's not. It's not. I
right,
would say that the entertainment and news media is far more important
mm,
than elected politics. So we buy into that story,
Right.
and then politicians never speak well of each other on the other time. The other team can never do it. It's not just that they got something half right. It always has to be they're despicable.
Yeah.
They're evil,
Corrupt.
corrupt. Nobody could possibly have voted for this candidate, having made the decision that they don't like some things about them, but they like these other things about them. And this is something I think really is a problem in our current moment. It's the story of polarization, not the polarization itself. The
Right. Okay.
story of polarization is actually more extreme than actual polarization. The levels of policy differences that exist, at least in the industrialized West, are not that extremely different from each other. Like
Mm.
the current, the British Conservative Party, which is not a party that I have ever voted for, pioneered same-sex marriage
Mm.
becoming legalized in the UK, and presented it. David Cameron, the last prime minister but one, presented it as marriage is a conservative value, so of course we should enable more people to get married. Right now,
Mm.
you can argue about the propaganda side of that kind of language, but the actual polarization is not that much. The
Right. Right.
story of the polarization says it has to be this much. We
Yeah.
have to hate each other. It's not enough to just say I don't agree.
Yeah.
I have to say what you think is despicable, and you are despicable for thinking it, and you couldn't possibly have any good reasons for doing so. And the history of conflict transformation processes and just good relations in society shows, first of all, that's a recipe for just delaying having a more interdependent society, or worse than delay. Um, uh, it makes it really hard to get on with the business of just living ordinary day-to-day lives. It's a distraction from the things that matter the
Right.
most.
Yeah. Yeah.
As I often do, my thoughts have gone like 7 miles away from where we started in
No,
this. So
that's
bring us back, Martha, bring us back.
okay, so I want to talk a little bit about our stories as a shelter, because we've
Yeah.
been sort of circling around that right from the start, that you're a story activist, teaching people, enabling people to tell a better story. So you talk about fear as something that we battle, something that we
Mm.
wrestle with, something that we need to conquer, something that we need to overcome. As I was reading that, I was thinking very much too about our language that we tend to use around illness. Um,
Mm.
that
Battling cancer.
battling cancer, battling mental illness, battling
Yes.
depression.
Yeah.
Like we gravitate towards
Yeah.
kind of warrior language.
Yeah.
Um, and and in contrast to that battle, that conquering, you tell this story of a pilgrimage, climb up a very steep, treacherous mountain, and toward the end or through part of it, you're in the driving rain. And at the top of the mountain, you come to this shelter, um, and are able to get into the shelter. Uh, the shelter didn't battle the rain or wrestle with it or conquer it. It made the rain irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was beautiful. It's also quite different from how we do sort of think about the challenges that we have on the
Yeah.
horizon, that maybe we don't need to conquer or battle challenges.
Mm-hmm.
We need to create shelter. Um, Step into your own story shelter and learn a new way of being. Stop trying to fight fear. Um, I was thinking about that in terms of dessert and dish, that kind of connected to that. I think about all of the ways that we talk about food and our bodies as something that we need to conquer, something that we need to fight against. Dessert is a temptation that we
Yeah.
need to guard ourselves against. I mean, that's a big reason why I like to have a different story around dessert that we share
Mhm.
and that invites us into a place of joy. I had never thought of that reframing of the dessert story as a shelter, but it's kind of, it's a story shelter.
Mhm.
Um, is there a story that you most needed to stop battling,
Mm.
that you needed to create a shelter instead? Is there an example that you can share with us?
Yeah, one way into that is, if you think about it, when we talk about battling cancer, um, and if someone who's living and dealing with cancer finds that metaphor helpful, I certainly don't want to take it away from them. Uh, but I think there's a problem with it, and that is like, if you're using the battling metaphor and the person dies, then they lost,
I
they
know
were
that
defeated,
is the
right? And that's not
problem.
true,
It's not
you
true.
know.
Yeah.
And so, um, and battling fear tends to just make it bigger. It's the
Mhm.
oppositional energy recreating itself, or saying, don't think of an elephant.
Yeah.
Um, so um, the shelter metaphor is to do with the fact that I did walk up this mountain with a group of pilgrims, and it was driving cold rain, and it was really unpleasant. But we had to just keep going and keep going and keep going. And then eventually we got to this stone shelter. We stood inside the shelter, and we didn't have to worry about the rain anymore. We
Right.
didn't have to even think about the rain anymore, and we had not defeated the rain.
It was still there.
It was bouncing off the shelter,
Yeah.
you know. And I think we can weave shelters. We can't weave stones, but we can. So I'm mixing metaphors there. We can build, co-create shelters, and the practices I've mentioned earlier, breathing and interdependent community gatherings, and the book goes into more detail about how to do that, help build those shelters. But you asked about, was there a story that I needed to stop battling?
Mm.
And yeah, it's there's a story, I think, that a lot of people grow up with, that says they are not enough,
Mm.
that other people are somehow more equipped for life um, than we are.
Mhm.
And, in my case, maybe it was the guys who played rugby, the
Right.
guys who went on to be doctors and lawyers, because there was just a culture, like, and it was mostly unspoken, but sometimes it was said out loud.
Mhm.
Sometimes it was said out loud that these guys were better. And then, myths about conventional beauty, what good looks are. Um,
Mhm.
uh, and I was always measuring myself in relative to this perception that other people were more equipped for life than
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And actually, first of all, I was measuring my insides against their outsides, which is
Right.
a fallacy to begin with. And
Yeah.
most of us do it. And if you don't do it, it's probably because you have an unhealthily large ego. Right. So, like, you don't, like, you just have a different set of problems. If
Right.
And there do seem to be, there's some people who through good spiritual practice and being on that path, seem to let go of the comparison thing. And it's great to be around those people and learn from
Yeah.
them and receive from them. And a friend of mine, who I think this is a deep reality in her life, I was thanking her for the gift of teaching me this. And she said, well, look, this is a place I like to visit, but don't get me wrong, I don't live there all the time, right?
Right.
It's still an
Uh,
ongoing thing. So it's this thing of not being enough. And I think that part of that story in recent times for a lot of us has been uh, the public expression of aggression
mm.
seems like it has more power than whatever not aggression is.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
There's a cultural myth that again, to go back to, vulnerability is weakness, and then
Mm-hmm.
love is sentimentality,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
it's not. I've been using a metaphor that a friend of mine wrote about 20 years ago. He's a Kiwi writer called Mike Riddell. He said one of the ways you can define love would be the willingness of a, a woman who doesn't really know her next door neighbor to go into that next door neighbor who is immobile and to bathe their hemorrhoids.
Wow.
Right. And I think that is a magnificent, that starts to get toward what love really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Like, uh, and it's a continuum that goes as far as being willing to give up your life for people more vulnerable than you,
Mm.
if it is the only option
Mm-hmm.
to protect those vulnerable people. Like, and
Yeah.
it should
Yeah.
be an
That's
absolute
awesome.
last resort. And it's very, very rare. And I think a lot of times we use very, very rare examples as reasons not to even think about something.
Right.
Most of us aren't going to be asked to actually give up our lives, but we might be asked to give up some privilege or some resources or some power or some reputation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and what part of what I had to give up and continue to be invited to give up is the belief that I'm not enough. Because
Mm-hmm.
that can be its own form of pride. That
Mm-hmm.
can be its own form
Mm.
of, I'm so bad, I'm so special, that
Interesting.
I'm not like everybody else. They get to have an ordinary life, but I have to be extraordinarily useless. Right,
Wow.
right. Or
Yeah.
I'm so much more damaged than other people. And I have empathy and compassion because I think a lot of us feel that. I've been around people who, I was at a thing once where somebody said, I truly believe that I am the most damaged person in the room and my story is the worst story of anybody's story in the room. And part of their healing was to be listened to and then to have reflected back to them, none of us are alone. And
Yeah.
there's 10 people here who identify with your story. And
Yeah.
there's parts of your story that are beautiful and pleasant and exciting and courageous that you're not telling us. And we've had to, when we reflect back and ask you questions, but
Mm-hmm.
what's alive and what's good and what's freeing in your life right now. So I think the story I'm invited to give up is the one that says, I am not enough. And that's somehow the expression of aggression
Yeah.
is more powerful than my sense of call to love and be loved in a way that's worthy of the word love.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. I think people are really going to be able to connect to that. I mean, I think that that story of not being enough is one that we internalize in a
Yeah.
bunch of different ways. And, um, for me, I internalized that story in a big way in terms of my relationship with food and my body.
Mm-hmm.
And, that story of aggression is very much connected to that, as well, as in, like, if I just try harder, if I just succeed more, if I just
Yeah.
get this, that, and the other thing in order and sort it out, then I will be enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's this endless striving, it's this endless hunger that never gets to be
Mm-hmm.
filled. I can't consume enough, I can't be enough, I can't achieve enough, I can't be loved enough to fill that emptiness that I haven't relinquished. I haven't
And,
relinquished that emptiness.
and thank you for being willing to be vulnerable enough to say it, because I think you know this, um, and maybe you don't live here all the time, but your vulnerability helps. Paradoxically, I think part of the answer to not feeling like I'm not enough is to take a step toward becoming enough for somebody else,
Mm,
to serve, to help somebody else.
mm,
There's, first of all, it's good to do that when people need help, and if I can offer them help, great, it's good to do that.
yeah.
But secondly, I think there's this psycho-spiritual thing that happens that actually I end up starting to believe that maybe I'm a little bit more enough than I used to think, because I've seen the light in somebody else's eyes when they received from me.
Yeah.
And you sharing your vulnerability is a way of doing that. Coming, speaking out of an experience of great suffering. And I want to say also that the people who are engaged in these public displays of aggression, I think they're even more scared than the people who are tuned into the belief that they're not enough and who
Yeah.
have chosen not to participate in the public displays of aggression.
Yeah. I
That
think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and part of the challenge is the sort of humility, vulnerability, being in touch with those potentially gentler feelings also seems to go hand in hand with having low self-esteem.
Right.
Right? That like low self-esteem can be a doorway into gentleness,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And John O'Donohue used to say, underneath our fear there are embers of anger that can kindle justice. So like underneath fear there's anger, and it can go two different ways. It can go into destruction, or
Yeah.
it can go into selfless work for justice.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
so
I think that's really interesting. And I think that um, is a thread throughout your book as well. I think it's Parker Palmer who talks about the broken heart breaking in one of two ways, right? Like it break into shards of glass, then are wielded in a harmful way against others.
yeah.
But the broken heart can also break open and create
Mm, mm,
a place for others. It can
mhm,
lead to compassion, right?
mhm,
And I like that about anger and fear as well. Like
mhm.
there's these different possibilities of which way it can go. And I think, you know, um, what I hear in your book and what I would affirm in experience is that a lot of what decides which way it will go, I think, has to do with self-awareness and honesty about what's really going on,
Mhm.
as well as, again, having that circle of trusted relationships. And those circles of trusted relationships can be a lot of different things. Um, I think each of us has to find those kinds of trusted relationships that work and um, that nurture and that allow us that space to be honest about what's really going on, and allow others that space as well.
And you can see you can know emotional maturity when you see it.
Mm,
What I advocate for in the book is that people form circles of at least 3 people and no more than about 12, with people who don't all have to be greatly alike. In fact, it's really helpful if everybody is emotionally mature in ways that the other people in the circle aren't.
yeah, yeah,
So like you've got this part that I want to learn about, and I've got this part that you want to learn about, but we're all fundamentally committed to the idea that there is no higher calling than to love yourself and your neighbor as yourself, or to do
right.
unto others as you'd have them do unto you, which is not exclusively a Christian teaching. It shows up in all the major world religions and wisdom traditions. And
Hmm.
it also is the most efficient way to build a peaceful society.
Right.
It's like it's it's good medicine. It's good medicine. It
Yeah,
does
and
not fail.
it's a very simple, well used aphorism, but there's a lot of complexity to it.
Oh
Because,
yeah.
I mean, it really does, in a nutshell, articulate that how we love and perceive and care for ourselves is very much connected to how we're then able to um, participate in communities and neighborhoods that bring life.
Mm-hmm. And look, we have thousands of years of people who became wise and wrote it down. And we've got thousands of years of people who made music out of it. And we've got about 125 years of people recording that music. And we've got 126 now years of people making movies. And the resources exist.
Yeah.
It comes down to remembering and choosing to use those resources. It's very similar to food, actually, that, when we make choices about food that are in tune with how our bodies feel after we eat something, not is this a bad food on the calorie list or not, but like, how does my body feel when I do? Like, there's particular kinds of food, if I eat them, I will fall asleep within 30 minutes.
Right.
And it's always an unpleasant sleep. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't even like the taste of the food after the first bite. Right.
Yeah.
It's not about, I'm actually punishing myself by eating that particular food. It's similar with information and wisdom. The number of, another story I need to let go of is the story that says, I need to be following the news all the time. I need to be looking at news websites all the time.
Yeah.
Plenty of things I could read that would be more life-giving to me. And, you hear about the things you need to hear about, whether you're reading news websites or not.
Yeah.
So I think just the resources are there. The wisdom is there. It's not new. It's been there for time. It's just a matter of remembering it and choosing it.
And I think too that that's very much connected to, the neighbor who is willing to bathe the hemorrhoids of a woman,
Of a stranger,
right? Like the resources are there to help us break out of this sentimental idea of what we're talking about, that it's just Hallmark greeting cards and, roses on Valentine's Day. Like we're talking about real stories of being willing to enter into each other's suffering and to have our hearts broken open in a real way. And we have thousands of years of real stories to draw on to invite us to break out of just kind of a very narrow definition of what that means. And I mean, if I kind of go back to your comment about food, like eating one thing that puts you to sleep, troubled sleep in 30 minutes does tell you something about the story of that food at work in your body. And also those stories extend way beyond ourselves as well. Like, does this food just, prop up a multinational company, or does it support local business? Does food, is it connected to a story that is ethical and considerate and looks at sustainable practices for the earth? Does this food connect me to exploitative practices in the earth? Like the layers of stories just
and as you say that, I think a lot of us might hear those principles that you're advancing or those questions and might still hear, oh, that's another thing to beat myself up about. I didn't buy the right kind of ethical coffee, or I didn't. And this is not what you're doing. And I think part of what we're both being compelled by, and what I want to wake up to, is this is not punishment, it's invitation.
Yeah.
This is not stay within the lines or you're going to get in trouble. Look at this abundance, this beauty, there's an extraordinary opportunity. Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it feel better if you could drink coffee and enjoy where it came from, rather than, aren't you bad for not caring about where the coffee comes from?
Yeah, that's a really important reframing.
Yeah, like everything is here. Everything is here. Everything we need is here. Everything we could possibly want is here. We're invited to let go of the idea that our own impending inevitable death is the worst thing that can happen to us, or even the most important thing that's going to happen to us.
Yeah.
The worst thing that can happen to us is not living. That's the worst thing.
Yeah.
And the best news is that we know more today than ever, and have more access to more resources than ever that show us how to live well.
Yeah.
And I don't mean having a heated bathroom floor, if that happens to be, if you've got a heated bathroom floor and I'm not against you, but like I don't mean living in luxury for its own sake. I mean, when I stood under that stone shelter in the cold, it was still cold, right? Because it didn't have a door, and we were protected from the rain. That was not. It was not a 5-star hotel experience, but it was luxurious,
right?
Because of what I claimed about the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I need help to live there more often.
Yeah, I like that phrase. I want to live there more often.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I could talk to you all day. I just want to ask you, well, I want to ask you many, many more things, but there was one line in the book that it was one of my favorites, and that's saying a lot, because you can see I have like many folded over.
I'm really touched. You've read more of the book than I have.
Well, I've read and reread lots of parts of it. I've definitely read the whole thing, but you can see lots of folded over pages. So there were a lot of favorite moments, but this line might have been one of my favorites. You said, "What you think the soul exists may not really matter in the end, because what the soul actually does is insist." I wonder if you could, just to bring our conversation to a close, can you say more about insist?
Well, at one level, that's way beyond my pay grade to interpret a sentence like that. But I think what I'm sort of striving for there is to say, what we call spiritual practices like meditation and prayer and so forth don't depend on belief in dogma or doctrine, and particularly Eastern forms of spiritual practice, which are a lot to do with the body and breathing and things like that. And someone gave me advice once when I was really struggling with, do I believe in God or not? And I have so many doubts. And he was saying, well, just stop arguing about it and sit and breathe for a while, or do some meditation and see what happens. And the notion that the soul insists is you can't get away. Like you're never going to defeat in the battle with uncertainty. We're never going to defeat uncertainty.
Yeah.
And if we come to accept uncertainty is a fact of life, ambiguity is a fact of life. No one with any authority, with any real authority, is telling us we have to believe this and not that, or we have to be sure about this doctrine or this religion. We'll be taken to where we need to go. And at a more mundane level, I tend to think the folks who are like most committed to asserting their religious beliefs over against others, and the
Right.
people who are most committed to asserting their atheism over against other religious belief,
Yeah.
they're kind of proof that the soul insists, because they feel the need to prove either that they're right about it or that it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so there's, maybe it's a way of saying there's some things we don't need to be fighting about.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I think that it's very true. I also, I guess I hear in that statement too, um, just something about that ingrained um, desire, that ingrained pull that we have um, for that truer story that I think that you keep calling us back to, right? Like um, whether you whether you want to shape it with this language or that language or deny it altogether, there's this insistent pull in each one of us to connect, to be in
Yeah,
relationship, to build up
yeah,
community,
yeah.
to find joy, to realize that we can't find joy alone. Um, yeah, I
And we'll we'll never, well, most likely we'll never resolve some of the big questions.
hmm,
Um, but maybe we can kind of leave it with this, that part of why we're wrestling with so much fear in ways that seem new, um, is that the world got too big too fast. It also got too small too fast.
hmm,
So everything that's happening because of the internet can feel like it's happening to me
right,
or next door, you know. um, and all, but that's about the world getting too small, and by too big I mean the vastness of the world is so much more obvious than
hmm,
it used to be, even only a few hundred years ago, when people might never leave their own village.
right,
um,
right,
so that's the challenge. The world got too big and too small too fast,
yeah,
and we don't know where that's going to lead to.
hmm,
But there's something even bigger than the world, and that is the story you're telling about it and your place in it. And
yeah,
you can actually be bigger than the world, because the story you're telling about yourself also contains the story you're telling about the world.
yeah,
And you have an opportunity, I have an opportunity every day to go, and I think it was Václav Havel who talked about etching you, or I, the letter I, onto the vast panorama of being.
hmm,
And to recognize, with another Eastern European, with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said that the purpose, he realized the purpose of the Gulag when he was in prison in Russia under terrible conditions, that the purpose of that experience for him was spiritual growth. It
right,
wasn't justifying mistreatment, but once he accepted, okay, as with the Serenity Prayer, the things that he could not change, he could then give himself to the process of growth.
hmm,
And I guess where I want to live is in the story that says I can receive and enjoy the pleasures and the abundance and the beauty of earth and other people and connection and interdependent relationship, giving and receiving. I can etch myself onto the panorama of being and do something while I'm here. And the hard stuff, which might be terribly hard, and in some cases might even be fatal, um, the stuff I can't change, I can open up myself to a process of growth,
hmm,
or asking for help where I can.
hmm,
Even if I'm
hmm,
profoundly alone, I can still ask the universe for help.
yeah,
And I want to speak with tenderness to anybody who feels like they're in that place right now. This is not about telling you that you're bad because you haven't asked for help, or you should just get over your circumstances. Anything but.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
just a suggestion that there might be something bigger to your story than you've let happen up till now.
yeah, yeah. You say at one point in the book that that we can make love the protagonist of our story, you know, rather than
Yeah.
just the I, just the me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, actually, I think love is the protagonist of the world. But I get to choose whether I let that be the story I tell. And so, like, I'm not the protagonist. Humans aren't the protagonist. Love is the protagonist.
Yeah.
I describe it as being like the largest Broadway show never yet produced. It's got 7 billion cast members in it, and everybody has a big show-stopping number. And when you do your big show-stopping number, which is your life, the rest of us, our job is to stand behind you and support you in that, and kind of reflect light onto you in
Yeah.
that. And then
Yeah.
your job is to reflect light upwards and around you to
Mm,
the love that's there.
that's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah. That's powerful. It's beautiful and powerful. Yeah.
well, it has spoken to me.
Yeah.
It's good to be with you.
It's so good to be with you. Can you just tell people where they can find you online and
Yeah,
how they
yeah,
can get your book?
yeah. So the book's available wherever books are sold, and you can go to hownottobeafraid.com, and there's links there to buy it in various places. I encourage you to support independent bookstores if you can. And GarethHiggins.net is my personal website. If you're interested in exploring coming to Ireland with us at some point, you can find that at irelandretreats.com.
Oh,
It's all
nice.
really easy. My name, Ireland Retreats, and the title of the book with a .net or
Okay,
a .com afterwards.
great. And your name is one R, Gareth with one
Yeah,
R.
GarethHiggins, GarethHiggins.net.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gareth. It's been such a pleasure. And I invite everybody to join us every Wednesday for more great conversation and that weekly reminder to share together in the sweetness of life.